Broadcasting from the commodity capital of the world, Zurich, Switzerland, this is Insider's Guide to Energy.
This edition to Insider's Guide to Energy is brought to you by Fidectis. Go to www.fidectis.com for more information.
Welcome to Insider's Guide to Energy. I'm your host, Chris Sass, and with me today is Brian Wilkie. Brian, welcome to the program.
Thanks so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
Well, I'm excited to have you here. I know that when I first met you at Distributech, we were on a panel about fleets and things in the distance, and you told me you were going to be doing some interesting things in the future. So I'm circling back to find out, what have you been up to?
Yeah, so I feel like that feels like a long time ago to me now. We've done so much work since then, and I've done so many briefings and meetings for people about that work. So I work at National Grid. I am in National Grid New York's Clean Energy Development Team, and I'm focused on transportation, electrification, and the infrastructure required to accelerate that transition. One of the sort of problems or issues associated with transportation electrification is that people sort of forget that power is necessary at every place where you'll be charging an electric vehicle. And so what that means is that charging development today has been happening in the absence of a lot of forethought about the power required behind those chargers, right? And I think there's just a lot of work that needs to go into plan and engineer everything that's required for that. So that's what I've been up to since then.
And your focus, just for our audience, is basically New York, Massachusetts, kind of that Northeast quarter. Is that safe to assume that's kind of your core focus?
Yeah, let me level set people on National Grid. We are an international energy company headquartered in London, and we have regulated businesses in Massachusetts and New York. We are a gas and electric utility in those states. We also have a renewable development arm that operates and develops wind and solar resources outside of that regulated service territory. And interestingly, National Grid also controls a small sort of private equity investment firm that invests in startups that support our regulated businesses, including some of the stuff we're going to talk about today. So we're a multinational energy company, and we're in my work focused on highway electrification and large fleet electrification.
All right, and kind of in prep for the show, you'd sent me over a recent white paper that just came out, and you talked about kind of the challenges ahead. So where are we on this journey, and what have you uncovered for your planning?
Yeah, so I think it's good to help people understand that we're in basically the first inning of what might be a extra inning baseball game. Today in the United States, we're at about 1% of vehicles are electric, if not a lot less in some parts of the country. A lot of that is in the Northeast and California. And so we wanted to understand what happens when you look out into the future. What happens if our states in New York and Massachusetts actually meet their transportation electrification goals? And how big will some of the loads be at some of the highway sites that we analyzed in our study? And we also wanted to understand, when will those loads peak? Will they peak coincident with our system peak? Meaning, will we as an electric utility have to build incremental infrastructure to accommodate those peaks? Or are they going to peak overnight or in some other weird hours? And so that's really what we were trying to find out when we undertook this study with our partners at RMI, Geotab, and Stable Auto. That's what we were after.
And so what did you kind of figure out? I mean, and it's going to be interesting because I've had similar conversations with National Grid folks in the UK, and the response I got there was demand response should be okay, and that they have the capacity. They think that it will be there in time. So I'd be interested to see if it's different in North America.
Yeah, so I'd love to know who you talk to at National Grid. A lot of the foundation of our strategy here in New York and in Massachusetts is based on some early work that was done by our colleague Graham Cooper at National Grid, and he's head of future
That's who I
markets
spoke
there.
to.
And yeah, and so on the at home charging sort of level, a lot of our networks are going to be okay in the short term as it relates to electrifying vehicles for at home charging. Highway charging is a different animal, and large clusters of fleet vehicles are not the same. Those loads are of a different magnitude than plugging in your car to your outlet, assuming you don't even have a higher voltage outlet and wiring in your house and charging at like level 1 type level in your overnight, right? That's like so slow and low and cheap and affordable and a great way to charge. What we're looking at highways is high voltage DC fast charging, 350 kW, and in the future, in the not too distant future, and this might sound insane to people, we're going to be talking about 700 kW charging. And then you're going to multiply that by somewhere between 10 and up to 100 for iterations of that. So now you're talking somewhere between 30 and maybe up to 50, 60, 70, 80 megawatts of on-demand fast charging, where people want to run in, have a cup of coffee, use the restroom, get back in their car and see their battery at 80% and then head on their way. That is the expectations that Americans are going to have for the electrified future. And so that's what we modeled in our study. I think what we found is, not surprisingly, that's a lot of power. And not surprisingly, it's going to show up pretty fast in utility planning timeframe. In our world, to build a transmission interconnection, which is what you're looking at when you get beyond sort of 5 to 10 megawatts in our service territory, is a transmission interconnection. That's a 4 to 8 year project, sometimes 10 years. So
2035 is not particularly far away.
It's not far away. It's on our doorstep in transmission planning world. It's knocking at the door.
All right. But you just went, I think you changed gears mid thought there, right? You said, look, so, I brought Graham into the conversation. Probably wasn't fair, but I figured I'd mention that we'd spoken with him on a previous podcast. But I think what was interesting is you were saying, look, it's the commercial fleets and some of the pro show prep you sent me, right? And so, yeah, I think I might go have a cup of coffee while my car charges, but I also think that a lot of cars may be charged before they get on the road, right? So yes,
they always are. Yes, they always are.
So that's right. The old gas station model may change for your typical person driving, unless I'm driving from New York to like Florida or somewhere where I have to stop and charge. But if I'm just going, from New York to Boston, my car's probably charged before I leave, right?
I think that you are falling prey to a misconception in the charging infrastructure world, which is that previous behavior is an indicator of future behavior. Today, 80% of charging happens at home because the people that buy electric cars today are rich and they have a driveway or off-street parking. And if we're going to move to a fully electrified transportation sector like National Grid supports, we need everybody to drive an electric car. And that includes people like me who live in Brooklyn, New York and have street parking. And so I think wouldn't
you still charge at your meter? Like, there's so many cities that are trying to electrify, so you charge on the street, right?
Today in New York, there are 100 street chargers. Okay. There are 2.2 million cars in New York City. So no, I wouldn't. And I think there's a question. I think there's an open question about whether the gas station model goes away or not. I think we believe that cars will continue to stop at the same places they stop today at highways because people have a bladder. And what's more important than battery range is bladder range. And when you stop to use the restroom and your kids need to get out of the car because they're kicking the back of your seat and they need to run around for 15 or 20 minutes, it's our assumption and belief that people are going to just go ahead and plug in their car because they're not sure when they're going to reach the next charger. Will their hotel have one? Will it be available? Will they be ubiquitous enough that their hotel will definitely have one? They don't know. So they do what I do today when I stop at a gas station along the highway, and they will fill up. And so yeah, that's an ingoing assumption that we have, and we could be wrong, but I think the cost of being wrong from our perspective is is perhaps lower risk than the cost of just assuming that it's all going to go the way that some people say it's going to go, that everyone's going to charge at home all the time and charge at work all the time, and the gas stations will disappear. We just don't see that happening. So we wanted to understand what happens if gas stations continue to exist and people continue to stop at them and get a cup of coffee and go ahead and top off their battery for 15 or 20 minutes. And that's what we were really trying to figure out. And I think importantly, to getting to some of the questions discussion we're having now, is like, what are the policy implications of that? You know, how does the regulatory structure need to change? What you know is that there's a charging ecosystem. There's at-home charging, there's workplace charging, there is shopping mall charging, level 2 maybe. And then there's going to be a need for a lot of DCFC. And highways will be one component of that.
So what else did you find out? I mean, I think one of the other links you talked about that was in the commercial side, right? You said, okay, well, I think you sent a link to Tesla trucks, and we're implying how that would change things. So I get the consumers and getting everybody to drive electric, but I think fleets are probably going to happen before everybody's driving an electric car. If that's another one of my assumptions, you can tell me I'm wrong again. But that would be my assumption, that I would see fleets before I see 90% penetration of passenger vehicles, right? So how does that impact what you're planning?
That's a really good question. So the medium and heavy duty sector is where the real impact comes. If you look at our study, you'll see that passenger vehicle charging loads at the sites that we studied across New York and Massachusetts will get big, 2, 3, 4, 5 megawatts. That's not nothing. But when the full medium and heavy duty sector begins to fully electrify is when you see the slope of those load curves really go up quickly. And that's a function of the power required for those types of vehicles. Interestingly enough, from the time we started our study until today, the Inflation Reduction Act passed in the United States. That seminal and important, some would call it generational, piece of legislation has pulled forward the total cost of ownership of all sectors of the medium heavy duty trucking market by between 5 and 10 years. So what does that mean? That means for someone that operates a fleet of vehicles, by 2023, the TCO, the total cost of ownership, meaning the cost of buying an electric vehicle versus buying a diesel powered vehicle, will be positive, meaning you buy the electric vehicle over the diesel vehicle by 2023. I just need to put a finer point in that. That means that it will be an economic decision to buy an electric truck for almost every sector of the medium heavy trucking market. That is a few months away from now, and that is a huge deal, because from our perspective, going back to the amount of time it takes for us to prepare the grid for large loads for medium heavy duty trucking and provide an interconnection to the transmission system, remember, 4 to 8 years, right? So
you're making a previous guest sound more logical. So we had a guest on board on I don't know, last couple of months, that out of New York, New Jersey area, which basically has batteries on truck and on boats. That's something EV Edison, I think, was the company. And their premise was that during that 5 to 8 years or whatever you need to get the capacity, they would put these huge batteries in place. And it seemed a bit far-fetched, but as you say this, that sounds less far-fetched.
Yeah, I mean,
these are big batteries. These are like tractor trailer size batteries, right? These are
yes, we know this company. Yes, very familiar with them. It's a small world we live in, as you know. I think the thing that I keep reminding our engineers of here at our company is the world in a couple of years is going to look vastly different than it is today. And it looks vastly different today than it did a year ago, right? When we started this study, people thought we were crazy to talk about 350 kW charging on the highways. In New York State, the New York State Thruway is installing 4 350 kW chargers every 25 to 50 miles as we speak. They will be operational within a month. We were out of our minds, right? People couldn't believe that we were forecasting, oh, people will be charging at 350 kW. Now, when we did the study and talked to the Department of Energy in the United States, they told us you really should have started like thinking about 700 kW charging, because that's going to be the future. So it's just, and I remind myself this all the time, the technological landscape is evolving so quickly, so quickly. Another thing we had to think about when we did this study was efficiency losses, right? We know that particularly in the medium heavy duty sector, in very cold climates like we operate in the winter months, that you can have up to 40% efficiency losses in the vehicle and the battery and the charging. So you need 40% more power for that vehicle in January, February, or December, January, February, depending on where you live. We also knew that those efficiency losses will certainly decline. They're not going to be 40% in 2045. They'll probably be more like 10 or 15%. So we didn't include that in our study because we just knew the technological landscape was going to shift.
So
anyway,
what happens now, right? So what you just said is the newest legislation turned 2023 into a year where the ROI for buying these mid to heavy vehicles makes more sense, but the infrastructure is not there yet, right? So if suddenly all the fleets get electrified, and I don't know how many EV kind of or electric trucks can be produced in 2023, so I don't know what kind of impact it would have in the region of upstate, the New York region or the New England region or whatever. I'm not sure how many they're capable of churning out in that time frame. How do they get there, right? Because there's clearly going to be a gap from what you just described in this conversation.
Yeah, I mean, what you're going to see is companies like Daimler Trucks and Volvo and Tesla Trucks. I mean, they are going to scale up their operations immensely because the orders are already starting to pour in, right? And the problem, this is the chicken or the egg thing, right? They have a hard time selling trucks. Well, they have a hard time accelerating their sales targets if their customers are not seeing or are concerned about the charging required to buy that truck, right? There's two different sort of sectors I think about in the trucking market. There's the return to base. Well, there's really three. Return to base fleets, right? Think of your local UPS, Amazon trucks. There is the sort of middle mile trucks that move things from one warehouse to another. And then there's the long haul trucks that, multi-day or, sort of hundreds and hundreds of miles over the course of a couple days type trips, more regional, right? So it's very different. All those sectors have very different needs. And for the fleet depots, there's one specific, today, a lot of those trucks, vans and trucks are economic, right? The ROI, as you called it, is a good one for that use case. With the Inflation Reduction Act in the United States being passed, the middle mile sector is now, the ROI is positive. The trucking companies are telling us is, when's all this power going to be here? When are all the chargers going to be here? And we say back to them, like, well, we're being told by our regulators, where's all the trucks? The sales target, you're selling like 0.002% of your vehicles are electric. So it's been this very interesting conversation that we've been navigating as an electric utility to say, well, we know they're coming. And the regulators say, well, we don't see them. And the truck manufacturers say, they're coming.
Right.
And so it's been difficult. And that's part of the reason we did this study, is to just provide a window into the future. To say,
crystal ball though, and you're probably going to say I fell into another trap here, but for years there's been talk in the US of having maybe some different interstates just for trucks and stuff. So when you're looking at building infrastructure, are you looking at along the current infrastructure as is today, or are we looking at having capacity for the future in, like, breaking the model that we've been going by, at least in trucking, right? Because I have heard forever kind of rumblings of truck roads, or kind of a loop around the US, for lack of a better state. Is that kind of thing going to come with this electrification, you think, or is that just a pipe dream for people because of capacity, because of density, right?
Well, when you say, sorry, make sure I want to make sure I understand your vision of the future. What you hear is like the future that's never been realized. What is it that
Like separate
what?
highways for trucks because the capacity there's just getting too much trucking going on, right?
Oh,
And highways,
interesting.
a
Yeah,
separate infrastructure.
sure. Yeah. Well, I think you already see that on I-95 in New Jersey, for example, right? You've got a truck lane and a car lane. You in a lot of places you have separate fueling infrastructure for trucks, right? Think truck stops versus gas stations. Um, I think it from our perspective, what we know for a fact is that the trend of globalization will continue. 70% of goods in the United States are moved by surface trucks today, and that we think will continue. And more goods will be shipped to the United States and other countries, manufactured elsewhere, going forward. And those corridors will continue to be used and useful, even more so in future years. I think the big finding from our study, the number one thing that I think I learned over the course of a year studying this is it makes a lot of sense for government to work with utilities and vehicle manufacturers and site developers and pick the sites that make the most sense from a transportation planning perspective and an electric infrastructure perspective. So, right, so it's sort of saying you could build a site up the highway a couple miles if you want, charging developer. But if you get beyond 5 or 10 megawatts on our system, you're going to need a transmission interconnection. And if you build up the highway 5 miles as opposed to right here next to this substation or next to this transmission line, you're looking at somewhere between 2 and 6, 7, $8 million a mile for transmission plus a new substation. That seems like a really stupid way to let this whole thing play out, right? I mean, stupid is maybe
So
too brutal, but
so what I just heard you say is look, there needs to be a public-private partnership um, to meet this challenge. Now, I'm assuming you're not counting eminent domain and other things like that into this conversation. That you're assuming the land is accessible near the substation in this conversation, or
that's
is that
correct.
irrelevant? Okay, and so and you're in a regulated place right now, so you're already working in a regulated in a government environment. It's just getting the public and private sector to join up, so get the developers and stuff and do some joint partnerships. Is what I'm hearing you say, and you think you're more likely to be successful. Is that
Yeah,
what I
and
just heard?
it's actually more on the government and transportation planning side. It's like squishing together transportation planning and utility planning and bringing along environmental justice communities that often host some of this infrastructure and that can benefit from the electrification of this sector in particular, frankly, and our regulators and technology companies, and saying let's get in a room and do the type of study that we did, but let's do it jointly, and let's put the pins on the map, and then let's all agree that the utility should start developing those interconnections, and then to your earlier point, the site developers, the charger owners, which National Grid is not in the business of owning charging in our service territory, can go as fast as they want. They can put in 40, and then the next year they can say, wow, we have a ton of demand, let's put in 40 more. And then they don't have to come ask us for anything. The interconnection's already there, the headroom is already there, and they can move with the market.
And then where are you? So as planning, you say we're in inning one, right? So we just showed up at the ballpark, and we're figuring this out. But the genie's coming out of the bottle, whether you want it to or not, right? The legislation's driving it. People are doing things. So how are you kind of being future visionary while actually trying to meet growing demand today, right?
That's a great question. It's literally just talking to some of our engineers about this exact thing. There will certainly need to be interim solutions, right? We're starting to have more and more conversations about the role that mobile storage will play. So as you were talking about earlier, batteries on the backs of semis that can be pulled up to a site and create
It
instant
sounds really
headroom.
crazy. I tell you, it sounds less when I talk to you, but it sounded really crazy the first time I heard that. So
No, it's very real. We've actually been talking to companies about procuring those types of facilities for our use, and there's some benefits to this, right? So if you had a customer that wanted to add, let's say 12 megawatts, and we'd say, well, it's going to take us 4 years or 6, but we have a battery that we can pull up to your site and give you what you need in the interim, and then we'll take it back, and then we'll bring it to another customer site who has the same exact issue. And that to me is like it's pretty exciting, and it's a huge paradigm shift for utilities who just want to build things and then never touch them again. This is saying, let's provide some optionality to allow us a bridge to that end state, right?
But I guess what I wonder, right? So you're talking about a world. I mean, you gave an early example, almost it could have been like computer and technology, the speed of innovation, the speed, because where it's going very quickly, but yet you're building infrastructure that takes 5 to 8 years to put in place, and then how long does the asset need to be in place for you to recoup the value of it? So are you going to have a bunch of stranded assets along this curve, or how do we avoid, because you're always going to be shooting behind the 8 ball, right? There's no way that you're going to get the right capacity 10 years from now. I think it'd be really hard to get it perfectly right. So
yeah,
so how do you avoid building a bunch of assets that are just going to be dotted along the New York State Thruway that are going to be obsolete in 5 years or 10 years when they're built?
Question. So that's the value that sort of mobile storage and mobile substations and oversizing transmission interconnection can provide, right? So the customer's load is 2 megawatts today. They're going up to 4 megawatts in 2 years, and then to 8, and then to 12, and then to 16. So rather than touch it 4 times, let's just touch it once. And to the extent we don't have the capacity on our distribution system today to accommodate them, let's provide them with a mobile storage unit to give them what they need in the short term, and then build the transmission interconnection one time. And by doing so, we will have created 55 megawatts of headroom at that site.
So is the transmission, it does. So is the transmission like national infrastructure, state infrastructure? Who's paying for the transmission lines, at least in the US?
Depends on the voltage and the utility and and the regulator. In our service territory, in New York, we'll just pick one because it is different everywhere. That this transmission interconnection that I'm talking about, this would be a 115 kV tap and a new substation, basically, along with some additional equipment. But at the high level, that's what we're talking about. That is regulated by the state, New York State Public Service Commission. And today, in our service territory, but not other utilities that operate in New York, that cost is paid by the interconnecting customer. That,
right, but I guess that's broken, right?
That's a problem from our perspective. That's a problem because the types of customers that we looked at when we looked at these sites, these are, men and women that are in the business of selling chicken sandwiches and candy bars. They're not manufacturing chips or I guess you fabricate chips fabrication or steel manufacturing or pipe. They're not an industrial customer, right? They're a light commercial customer. So, somewhere between 5 and, let's call it $50 million transmission interconnection is not in their ability to pay for. So it's something that I think regulators and utilities are going to have to get creative.
Well, it seems like it may need to be a national problem as well if it's infrastructure, right? So if it's heavy trucks and it's goods, you said that you studied goods manufactured in the U.S. or goods coming into the U.S. That seems like more than a state problem, right? If it's the highway infrastructure, right? So where there's a state component and a federal component, it would seem like from a national interest. But maybe that's from the cheap seats. Maybe it's too simple to understand it that way. But
no, I think there's some questions to be answered there. We don't have the answers yet, but I think there's some questions to be answered. And I think that's exactly what the federal government is grappling with as we speak. National Grid was the lead applicant on a DOE funded study to study this exact question. What will the medium heavy duty corridor needs be in a fully electrified or partially electrified medium heavy duty trucking sector? And so we're seeking that grant. We hope if we get it, it's a 2-year project where we'll do a similar study, but across the entire Northeast plus Pennsylvania and New York. And then we'll create a plan for the DOE to sort of follow and think through those exact questions. But I'd say today we don't have all those answers.
Well, so we're pushing up against time. We probably got time to probably pull this together. So we've gone all over just because, through the conversation, you said things that just sparked questions and interest. So what's your takeaway from this initial study that you got back? I mean, it seemed pretty positive. It seemed pretty comprehensive. The audience can find it online, that you can download and read the document, which I recommend. But what are you taking away, Brian? What did you achieve by spending the last year of your life doing this?
Aside from a lot of sleepless nights, the feedback on the study has been overwhelmingly positive. No one has sort of disagreed with the findings or questioned our methodology or any of the analysis at all. I think it's been incredibly, maybe the most rewarding thing I've worked on in my career. And I think the next steps for us are sort of what I described, that it's time to merge transportation planning and utility planning. It's time to get in the room and start answering some of the questions that you had on this call. Who pays? How big do we design the solution? When do we go from distribution to transmission? Where does mobile storage make sense? But I think with the one thing I feel more than anything today acutely is that we cannot wait. The time for building, doing pilots and experimenting is over. It's time to start building and moving much more quickly, because the market is going to drive this, and we're going to fall behind if we don't get started quickly.
Well, I'd have to agree, and I think if you're living in Europe right now and seeing where other countries are, I think you're going to see a great acceleration in the U.S. With the funding that's available now, and based on what you're saying, with the business model starting to make sense, just like we saw with solar, we've seen in wind, is when the economics make sense, it suddenly takes off and people start doing it. So I think I'll probably be pretty bullish on this, like you sound to be as well. Well, thank you so much for sharing with our audience today. I appreciate you coming on the podcast and telling a little bit about what you're doing. And I look forward to hearing how it goes when we start seeing this infrastructure come into place. I look forward to talking in inning 2 or 3. So.
That sounds like a ton of fun. And thanks so much for having me. It's been a real pleasure.
All right. Thank you so much. For our audience, hope you've enjoyed this content as much as I have. If you have, don't forget to subscribe, follow us, comment in the comments, and share the content with your friends. And we look forward to speaking to you again on Insider's Guide to Energy next time. Bye-bye.